Hi, Andrew.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
All right.
Good.
I
Let me introduce this. I'm Robert Wright. This is the Wright Show. Available on both streaming video and via audio podcast. Did you know that, Andrew? Is it on your podcast feed?
No.
Oh, man.
Obviously, it has to be.
Yeah.
I don't listen to a lot of podcasts because I don't drive. So I'm not in the car a lot. And when I'm home, I just tend to be reading.
You ever walk?
Yeah, I try and walk mindfully without a bunch of chattering in my head. Come on. No, and I also have dogs to take care of. I can't, when I'm walking with the dogs, I got to focus on them.
You've got high maintenance dogs.
Well, there are two of them, first of all. And
we have two. I walk two dogs and listen to a podcast. It's humanly possible.
Have you tried to walk two beagles? And that's the problem. They're a particular breed that will go everywhere, anywhere.
Yeah. Well, beagles are too nose-driven.
They're nose-driven. I mean, that's what they are. One is a beagle, one is a hound of sorts, and it's just wherever they go. So it's like Cirque du Soleil sometimes for me. So, but maybe I should. I'll definitely. If it's your podcast, Bob,
then you will change your lifestyle completely in order to accommodate it. Thank you, Andrew. In that case, I'll do you the favor of introducing you. You're Andrew Sullivan, famous writer, written such books as Virtually Normal and The Conservative Soul and other things. What's your favorite book to plug these days?
Love Undetectable, I think, is the best book I've ever written.
Love Undetectable. Got it.
It's really a meditation on friendship. And it's also about the psychological origins of homosexuality and also an AIDS memoir, all wrapped up into 3 essays.
Okay. So people should get all those books. But, most recently you've been writing in New York Magazine regularly, getting a lot of attention for that, sometimes because you say things that people disagree with. And I don't know where to start. I mean, there's several pieces you've written. You wrote a piece on the Me Too movement that got a certain amount of blowback that I assume wasn't entirely a surprise to you.
No, I was surprised there wasn't more. I mean, I mean, I haven't yet been drummed out of a job, although I'm sure that's obviously the objective of large numbers of people on Twitter, as it seems to be their objective to drive all sorts of people out of jobs. What's interesting is that the atmosphere is really ending in a sort of coercion as opposed to an exposure. I mean,
I think you're already segueing to another piece you've written. We all live on campus now or something?
Yeah. Where again...
Sorry, I interrupted you. Go ahead.
The general atmosphere right now is that instead of disagreeing with someone, you dismiss them, first of all, as being contrarian idiots who are just doing it for the sake of the trolling. You don't actually address the arguments, but you also demand and insist that they've committed such an egregious act of bigotry that they really should be fired and should never have been hired in the first place. I mean, that is almost now routine. I shouldn't have, but I started looking at Twitter a little bit because I wanted to promote my own pieces on it. It's unbelievable to me just how incredibly intolerant and hostile people are to opinions that are different than theirs. It's almost as if it's become non-negotiable. And if you disagree and you have any position of prominence or have a platform of any kind, the goal really is now not to expose your mistakes or errors, but to destroy your career and job, and with any luck, your character as well. That's the atmosphere that I see on Twitter, and it's really gross, and it comes out of, I think, to some extent, the shifts on campus. The notion that, for example, and this is a core notion now that I think is pervasive on the left in a way that I don't think it's ever been this way before, which is that the truth about a society is that we are entirely in a sort of neo-Marxist situation where the only and primary mover of our minds, even our bodies, is a structure of oppressions of various groups on top of various other groups. and that the goal of any expression, and all speech is an act, is to liberate and to prevent the marginalization and oppression of these various groups. So if you're doing something that's not doing that, or might be interpreted as not doing that, it's important that you be silenced or at least or drummed out of a job, because you're actively harming people. Often the expression goes harming people's lives, threatening their lives by saying certain things. That, of course, starts out on campus. It starts out in critical race theory, critical gender theory, but it has spread dramatically, especially because I think the web and web journalism is powered at this point largely by 20-somethings who were freshly indoctrinated, and they've been able to use Twitter as a weapon to attempt to police the discourse more effectively than they might have done in the past.
So is it going too far to say that you have some misgivings about the tenor of contemporary discourse, Andrew?
Yeah, I just, I think when you look, for example, at the pylon at the New York Times. I mean, James Bennett is an old and dear friend of mine. So full disclosure.
James Bennett was my intern, dude. When I was acting editor of the New Republic for 7 months, when Mike Kinsley was in England, James Bennett and Michael Newman were my two servants. How things have changed.
Well, James and I we overlapped in the New Republic and became really good friends. And of course, he was my boss at the Atlantic when I was there.
Right.
I think what's happening there is that essentially what I would describe as a liberal attitude, which is that diverse arguments, a range of opinions, is regarded as harmful by many people, and therefore the goal is to not just disable that harm, but to use opinion as a means for the liberation of various permanently oppressed groups. And he, I think he is a classical liberal in that sense. He just thinks, yes, everybody's point of view, including that, by the way, I support this too. I think there should be a full inclusion of the current cultural Marxism that is permeating the left. I think that deserves to be understood, to be presented, but I also think it deserves to be countered. And I do think diversity of thought is incredibly important in a forum like the New York Times. I think he's doing a pretty good job. I wouldn't have hired exactly the person he's most famous for hiring, but
you mean Bret Stephens or what is it? Barry Weiss? What is it?
Barry Weiss. I think Barry's terrific. Bret Stephens is fine, but I guess except it would be nice in some ways if you're looking for diversity on the right. It seems to me important to include at this point all the new voices on the right that are out there. The nationalist voices, the non-intervention.
So like somebody from the American Conservative magazine.
Yeah, someone like that. Someone who could represent, someone who would even support Trump in some circumstances. Some diversity.
Like a Scott McConnell or. Scott McConnell was on Blogging Heads. He voted for Trump. He's a little disenchanted, as are a number of Trump voters, partly because of Trump's foreign policy turned out not to be truly Buchananite. But
that would be very interesting to read, a critique of Trump's foreign policy from the right. All those interesting new things. And yet Stephens is obviously a completely hackneyed neocon, completely unreconstructed.
Well, this is
you know exactly what he's going to say about everything before he says it.
Yeah, no, it's funny. Very few of I guess the critiques I'd make of the Times op-ed page, I'd make about the opinion structure writ large, which is just that I think neocons get a little more airtime than they really need to. That's a funny thing to say, because it's not like there's a huge amassing of them on the Times op-ed page. This is a foreign policy specific critique, is that I think what there was a shortage of writ large in the opinion realm is people who actually oppose the Iraq War in advance. I mean, people who have a kind of it's a critique of foreign policy that is often associated with the left, but as we just kind of alluded to, it's represented on a certain part of the right. But it's anti-interventionist, and I mean, if you look at all the people in the Times or anywhere else, I mean, the Washington Post is worse. The Washington Post has actively neocon inclinations. And that's, it's, you know, so from my point of view, it's worse. I just think this has been said, but given that the Iraq War was the greatest foreign policy blunder of our time, and I know, you know, you and I were on different sides of it, but you quickly, in the wake of it, you know, amended your views and said it had been a mistake to support.
I understood why. I mean, in some ways, if I want, let's not go over that again, but I'm happy to, which is that.
No, my point is just
I'm really mad at myself for not living up to things that I should have, given my previous convictions about many things, supported. But anyway, I recognized it's not just an intellectual error, it was a moral failing on my part. And,
well, I'm not trying to get any more self-flagellation than I've already gotten out of in past episodes, but
but it'd be good to have something like somebody who has that.
Well, my point is, when there is a consensus that you've had a foreign policy blunder, it seems that in general the op-ed realm should have a fair representation of people who either opposed it in advance or seriously amended their approach to foreign policy in the aftermath. And there's virtually nobody at any of the major outlets who falls into, so for example, I'd say at the Atlantic, Peter Beinart qualifies as somebody who really significantly amended his approach to foreign policy after supporting the Iraq War.
Yeah, he'd be a great addition to the New York Times. But of course, again, he's a white male, so he's not able to be hired.
Yeah, so we're about to move to where we started out. But let me finish off something that, having said that I have my critiques of both the Times Op-Ed page and the opinion realm writ large, it does seem to me that the specific things that James has gotten in trouble for are often pretty dubious at best. I mean, like, I was totally opposed to the hiring of Bret Stephens, but a funny thing, it was like his very first column. Well, first of all, it says something about where we are, that the main thing Stephens takes heat for is climate change, and there are very few complaints actually about the foreign policy part of his neoconservatism, relatively speaking. But in his very first column, he really kind of walked back his whole position on climate change and said, I'm one of you. He basically said, I am accepting the liberal, if you read it closely, he said, I'm accepting the liberal view. That wasn't enough. I mean, he just got trashed for that. And then Barry Weiss, and again, Barry Weiss, whatever. These are the two people whose hiring I would most complain about. But her thing on the immigrant, I mean, she mishandled it. You know, okay, so she got in trouble because she tweeted this thing about how immigrants rock or whatever, because the daughter of immigrants did well in the Olympics. She totally mishandled even the aftermath of it, I grant you, but it didn't seem to be quite a capital crime.
That's a capital crime. I mean, again, she's trying to celebrate immigration and to make that point of view, and then of course to see the leaked Slack where she's suddenly condemning, triggering Asian Americans on staff towards memories or fears of internment. I mean, you also have to understand the climate in which this stuff is happening.
It's true. That said, I always remind myself that I don't know what it's like to live as a minority in the United States. By the way, I don't know if you caught it, but a few hours before we taped, somebody was, I think, rightly dismissed from the New America Foundation. Did you see this tweet about...
No.
Oh, it was taken as I'll let people Google it, but he was basically kind of making fun of an Asian accent.
Yes, I saw that.
It was just so clear. It's like, and this guy's like a terrorism expert, right? It's like, wait a second, you're in charge. I mean, it's your mission to like do things like say, well, I wonder how potentially radicalizable Muslims are viewing A, B, or C, and you are so clueless that you know, that just blew my mind. I had never heard of the guy.
That was nuts. That was nutty. I mean, there's South Park, of course, may peace be upon them, and they can do great Chinese. I mean, I'm English, so we grew up giggling at funny accents our whole lives. It's in Monty Python from the beginning to the end. But again, that's now the equivalent of interning millions of people. So I have to.
But then again,
it's a good question you ask about minorities. Like, is it possible for people to talk about issues around minorities who aren't a member of that minority? And my answer to that is absolutely.
So that's a yes. That's a yes.
That's an absolute yes. We can all talk about whatever we want. The thing that matters is the cogency and coherence of our arguments and the quality of our writing. That's, to my mind, is what is the core value. And sometimes being in your own experience is actually distortive sometimes of reality. And, I've been in many minorities in my life. And I'm always interested in outsiders' takes on what is actually going on, that are not afraid, that aren't intimidated, that are curious, that are open-minded about it. I'm not in favor of people just being blanketly bigoted towards groups of people, but I favor any straight person having a totally open conversation about what gayness is, or what homosexuality is, et cetera, et cetera. And I have nothing to fear from that. All I have to fear from that is that I might find out that I'm wrong about something. And that's never fun to discover, but we know as classical liberals that it should be fun to discover when you're wrong. And the only way we can do that, I know this sounds pious, but the only way is to allow these multiplicity of arguments to come. And it's only Marxism, it's only this foul odor coming out of the campuses that is crimping this, because it's assuming that people's views are a matter of their own moral worth. And the standards being applied are so incredibly high that something good-natured like what Barry Weiss did is somehow a capital crime. She handled it poorly afterwards, I think. But at the same time, for goodness sake, I mean, she was trying to do the right thing.
Although, isn't she herself? I mean, I don't want to, get too distracted, but according to
she's a terrific person.
About her, she herself made her name by trying to get some Palestinian professor fired because of his views or something. I
don't know the full background of that. All I'm judging is what she's written in the Times, and I think she writes well, and I think insofar as she's been able to bring some more conservative voices onto the page, it's important, it's good, it's necessary. But the question is, what kind of conservatives? And as I said before, we have Ross, who's a good social conservative, thoroughgoing social conservative, but kind of a sophisticated. You kind of want someone, for example, who is pro-gun, for example. You want someone, and I don't think there's anyone there. You want someone who's anti-interventionist. You want someone who is critical of Israel, for example. I know you'd be happy to hear that. I'd like there to be someone who favors restricting immigration, someone who actually supports the building of the wall, or a variety of other measures to curtail immigration. That's never going to happen. But that's a huge part of the debate we're having right now, and it's absent in those pages.
Yeah, I think somebody like Nick Kristof is periodically critical of Israel. Even Tom Friedman, if things get too bad, will he's written a couple of really good columns along those lines. My beef is more about interventionism, and I think Kristof's the closest to being okay there. So I guess we should say, I don't know if we've mentioned it, but I guess people know or got the idea. Of course, yours is not a critique from the left. There are critiques of identity politics kind of from the left. I gather is Mark Lilla wrote the well-known book that got so much flack. Is he basically from the left? I was never sure about his actual kind of ideology, but
he's a friend of mine too, so I don't want to put words into his mouth, but it was never actually my feeling that he was of the left.
That was my sense. It was taken that way as a liberal critique of current progressivism.
Well,
But
there is a liberal critique to be made. Unfortunately, it takes a conservative to make it in this climate. There's simply, what's staggering to me is the weakness of liberalism towards the left, just how easy it's blackmailed, how easily it capitulates, how insecure it is about its own values and virtues.
I mean, I've traditionally been, I don't know where I am on this issue. I mean, my main concern is with Trump and Trumpism these days. And so I do think the question Lil raised, I think, is an important one, which is, does a particularly vociferous version of identity politics help Trump? Did it help him get elected?
I would put it this way, that I think that it's liberal democracy that's under strain in general. Mm-hmm. And I think the greatest strain being put on it is by Trump and a Republican Party that is easily the most dangerous organization on the planet right now, in my view, just in terms of what the recklessness of which it's governing our society. But I also think that the response to him, sometimes understandably, actually echoes. There's a way in which the identity politics of both reinforces each other. And the more Trump actually becomes the most grotesque left-wing stereotype of a white supremacist, the more their own analysis of the society, which despite being the most diverse, multicultural society ever created in the history of that, is still a white supremacy, just as it was in the 18th century, gains force, absolutely gains force. He has empowered the left against the middle and empowered the far right against the middle. And I think the battle is on both fronts.
I mean, it has been said, that Trumpism is itself a form of identity politics.
Of course it is.
Do you think?
I don't think it was necessarily created, but I think they had this sort of symbiosis of both sorts of identity politics.
Oh, as is often the case. I mean, if you to get back to Israel, the Likud, the more what used to be considered the more extreme right wing part of Israel, and Hamas or whatever, or Islamic Jihad or whatever you want to see as the extremists on the Palestinian side. I guess I'd say Islamic Jihad now. They have a symbiotic relationship. They each are good for each other's base. And that's kind of what's going on in America now. Yeah.
I mean, and you see this especially around issues of race. And you also see it around issues of my own, areas, which are homosexuality or transgender identity. That the movement of those movements further and further to the cultural Marxism that, and I use that as a shorthand, and we could talk about it at greater length, but is notable. For example, I'm constantly irritated by this notion of an LGBTQ community, and let alone an LGBTQ person, which I've seen constantly referred to. There is definitionally no such thing as an LGBTQ person. You can't. Well, isn't it more like a coalition, or no? It's not. I mean, everyone. You can't have all those letters. I mean, that most people under that umbrella do not think that each of those letters applies specifically to them, right? That's acknowledged, isn't it? Well, yes, but you're called LGBT. You're not called gay anymore. And so you are subtly enfolded into an ideological construct. Well, but isn't that like saying if you're Chinese, you're Asian, or if you're French, you're European, but you're also, for some purposes, we call you French, and for some people... Well, what do gay people and transgender people share? At this point, my expertise runs out of fuel. I'm not that well versed in this stuff. Well, obviously... Well, what they share, I'll tell you what they share is some of the kind of intolerance they face comes from the same source, right? I'm not sure that's the case always. And the question of whether you should be defined by the intolerance of others is also another argument, whether you can be defined by your own existence and your own culture. I can understand, for example, when there were laws against lesbians and gays together, that forms an alliance to overturn those laws. Once those laws have been overturned, it's not so clear. For example, gay men and lesbians are often socially very segregated, don't really interact very well. And I say that as someone who's lived in many different places. I live in Provincetown 4 months of the year, where it is actually much more integrated than elsewhere, but it's the exception that kind of proves the rule. Also, I'd say this about the transgender movement, at least in some of its formulation, is essentially a denial that gender is binary. That it's a denial that gender exists as a function of biological sex. For gay men and women, the insistence upon biology as a sex, as connected sex, is pretty central. The reason we're gay is because we specifically are attracted to one gender and not the other. So, in fact, you could argue these two communities are diametrically different from each other, have very different...
what, you mean gay people versus transgender people? Or yeah.
So, for example, among the newly emergent strands of transgender thought is that your gender identity is completely unknowable to people from the outside, certainly not detectable by your genital organs, and that if a kid at 9 years old the boy says, I think I'm a girl, or wants to put on dresses, they're automatically understood to be trans. Now, a lot of those little boys actually are gay and will grow up to be gay. So in some ways, by forcing that, by coercing, well, not coercing, but by solidifying young children into the trans category, as opposed to just letting them be and seeing what happens as they shake out over the years, you're actually eviscerating, you're actually terminating gay lives and making them trans lives. That's actually, that's an obvious conflict. So that there are issues here that deserve being aired more fully, but which are flattened into this ideological construct.
Is your view common, or are most gay people actually fine with being considered to be under this umbrella along with trans people and so on?
I think most people just go along with it. I don't think they really think much about it. I think I'm obviously an exception for most, because I think about this a lot, and I don't share certain presumptions of the left. So inevitably, but there are, you have to remember, a third of gays voted for Trump, for fuck's sake.
The other thing about the umbrella is it's not quite by definition, but de facto on the left. I mean, it's part of the Democratic coalition. It's part of the progressive coalition, and you're not necessarily, although you're not a Trumpist. So at the moment, you may not identify very closely with the Republican Party. You're a conservative.
Large numbers of gays and lesbians don't identify with the left. Large numbers. They're often not very vocal because there are social consequences for their speaking out. But by and large, they're not. And what people say privately and what they're prepared to say publicly are very different things. So I think there are some parallels, but they are very different. And the notion that gender is entirely socially constructed is not something I think that most gay men and lesbians would agree with.
Okay. Now let me ask you a question. So the issue you've been talking about regarding just what you see as kind of a suppression of free speech on the left, does that have a counterpart on the right?
Of course it does. And
what form does it take on the right? Because it's not exactly the same kind of policing, right?
Well, I think insofar as, moderate conservatives or people who regard themselves as center-right are described as cocks. It was the subject of intense mockery. The space and oxygen and respect accorded to them is minimal. The way you look at CPAC and you see how what has been a rather diverse bunch of views is now so much more concentrated into a hardcore Trumpist agenda. It's happening there too. I mean, and it feeds on itself again. I think social media also has a horrible part to play in this, because the advantages of extremism are great, and the advantages of moderation are very small. The incentives are structured in such a way. They're even structured in such a way that because of this echo chamber effect, the social media effect, that even media organizations that need and want clicks are tempted to conform. So for example, where is the critique of identity politics on the Times Op-Ed page? Nowhere.
Mark Lilla probably showed up there when his book came out, right? Somewhere he probably showed up.
Only to be subsequently mocked and pounded and hounded every single place he looked.
Well, you can't hold the New York Times responsible for that. They didn't do the
No, I don't. And look, I'm not. And again, I don't want to. This is not censorship. This isn't a violation of the First Amendment. The thing I would say is a violation of the spirit of the First Amendment. That's what I would say.
Well, what did you think? I mean, I don't want to obsess on them, but what did you think of the firing of this woman who was friends of a neo-Nazi? I forget.
I think it was. I think once you read more and more of the context of it, I think it was. She clearly deserved to be hired. I think that given her history, and once you read all through it, there's an interesting, actually, piece by her in the Atlantic which just came out, which I thought was very persuasive.
Post-firing it came out?
Yes, it came out today.
Oh, so she hasn't been thoroughly stigmatized then.
And she just explains the case. An invention, a doppelganger, she put it, was fired. She wasn't what she was being portrayed as being. And anybody who's complex in any way will have, in this current climate, be turned into a caricature of one side or the other. The better to hoist them with.
So one question is what we do about all this, and by all this, I don't mean just the speech issue, but the mutually reinforcing tribalism issue. And by the way, thanks for plugging in one of your recent pieces the Mindful Resistance newsletter, which I'm now plugging, which I put out, which people can see at mindfulresistance.net.
Well, at the same time, I think that it's urgent that what this president has been doing and the way he's conducting his office be exposed with extreme urgency.
Well, that's the challenge. I mean, that's what we're grappling with, because on the one hand, one thing I try to emphasize, and we touch on sometimes in the newsletter, is, try to be mindful of when your reaction to Trump is just strengthening his base. At a minimum, try to be aware of how what we're saying is being processed on the other side of the divide, and when whatever strengthening of his base it does is worth it, and when it's not worth it. Because almost every form of outrage we emit is strengthening his base. That's just the way it's processed. I mean, it's so tribal that almost anything critical said of him is taken as proof that everything's fake news and it's the lying media and so on. But that doesn't mean there are no things worth speaking out about, even speaking out about with passion. And it's a real challenge, figuring out which is which.
Especially within social media, because emotions run high. Yeah. This is a challenge for all of us as writers, I find myself, one of the benefits of not blogging and actually having, an editor and a process of writing the pieces I've been writing is that the editing helps me remove those passionate and emotional parts of it that would unnecessarily alienate people. Mm-hmm. In other words, evidence, argument, try not to be that aggressive. I remember when I wrote Virtually Normal, which is the first book to argue for marriage equality, I went through the whole book to remove anything that might inflame someone who might not agree with me. So you try and keep it constantly on the reasonable level. Now, of course, the counterfactual to that is Obama, who was about as reasonable as one could possibly hope, who had the ability mindfully to resist almost anything, and yet didn't seem to make a single difference to the right. Their hatred, pathological hatred of him, was
yeah. What that made me aware of is how fine a line he had to walk to do what I hoped he would do, which is not what he did. I mean, because he did make a few missteps. I understand how that fed the antipathy toward him. But on the other hand, there were so few that you realize he had a tall order.
It was out of all proportion.
Yeah.
To what I would regard as a rather moderate Republican did in office.
Yeah.
I mean, if you looked at a moderate Republican from the 70s, I don't think you'd find much to disagree with Obama. It's just the way this thing has been turned upside down.
But the social media point, I was just thinking today, I was actually thinking not about how quickly, you get blowback, but how quickly like emotive tweets get shared and go viral, and like harshly judgmental tweets go viral, and how, it's of course all about emotion. And this is another thing I mean by mindful is just be aware of the emotions that are driving you. Before you click retweet, be aware of like what emotion is driving you to retweet. Is it an emotion you should honor? Does this make sense? And blah, blah, blah. But one thing I realized is like, I mean, this is just so obvious, but it's just like, when you and I were at the New Republic or whatever, before you shared an opinion, you inherently had a huge amount of time to reflect on it. It just almost couldn't be done strictly on the basis of emotion because it was impossible to share news that fast. You had to, there was a mandatory cooling off period just by virtue of the technology. And
even then we weren't that cool. There was a lot of tempers flaring at the New Republic.
Well, no, that's true. Well, there were. And there was a lot of, I mean, I'm sure I'd be embarrassed to go back and look at a lot of my own writing, how righteously indignant it was.
Can I ask you a question about, I was thinking about this piece you wrote. I think it was called The Female Mind or The Female Brain.
Well, there was one called Why Men Are Such Beasts. Mike Kinsley put that on the cover.
No, this was in the 70th anniversary issue. It was about the female mind.
Was that the one when you were editor?
Yeah.
That was the one. Was that the one about feminism and how feminists should reckon with evolutionary psychology?
Yes.
I think it was.
I think that was the one.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, that is now. I just want you to defend.
Listen, I gotta go, Andrew.
You see, I mean, this gender stuff is just so insane.
I just realized. Oh, listen, I'm running late.
You have to do the Michael Wolff thing. I'm sorry, I can't hear you. And when the guy asked, "Can you hear me?" he said, "No," and then realized he shouldn't say no because it was the most hilarious thing I've seen.
So let me preface this with a whole thing about evolutionary psychology. Can I? And then I will answer whatever question you want.
I want you to know. I want you to tell me.
Now, by the way, the
fundamental difference between the male and the female brain. That's what.
Okay. Yeah. This is exactly what I'm getting to. Now that piece, maybe it said the female mind on the cover and on the inside. I mean, you provided a number of provocative headlines for my pieces. Another cover story was just "Be afraid, be very afraid" by Robert Wright. That was your line on the cover of the New Republic. But this was, maybe it said the female mind on the cover, but I think inside it said "Feminists meet Mr. Darwin." That was yours too. I go with whatever the editor puts on. But anyway, let me say this. I want to back into this way. I am worried at the way evolutionary, my book, The Moral Animal, was largely an attempt to convince people that evolutionary psychology was not an inherently right-wing doctrine. Because I think the core of evolutionary psychology, I just think is true, first of all. I think it can be reconciled with a liberal, even leftist politics. And whereas, of course, historically, by stereotype, Darwinism had been thought of as right-wing. And some people reacted, like Stephen Jay Gould, as soon as he saw evolutionary psychology, he reacted to that by trying to tar it as right-wing. So my book was largely an attempt.
He was one of the most dishonest public intellectuals in the history.
I always hesitate to use the word dishonest because you don't know whether it's consciously dishonest or like with Trump, good example. Who knows how often he's aware he's not telling the truth. So I hesitate to use the word lie, but I'm basically with you that he was not a reliable source of guidance. But so, and I'm alarmed at the way now evolutionary psychology is more and more being thought of as right-wing, and I think there are a couple of sources of this, and some of it involves very loose use of the term evolutionary psychology. So the guy who wrote the Google memo and got fired, the guy who said, wait a second, there are sex differences, there will never be as many women engineers as men engineers, or whatever he said. I guess I've kind of perused it, I haven't read it carefully. He used the term evolutionary psychology. David Brooks wrote about him, defending him and saying, evolutionary psychology is true. But I want to be clear. He posited a number of gender differences. And although there may be data to back them up, in other words, that, survey data showing, say, that women are more socially inclined, whereas men are more obsessed with like things and machines. I don't know exactly what he said, but a number of these things where you may statistically find gender differences, they don't have a clear Darwinian theory that predicts that the basis of these will be genetic. So, the jury's still out when you find a difference like this, because obviously it could be cultural to some degree or wholly. And in some of these realms, like the one I just mentioned, there is not compelling reason to think a priori that there's a genetic difference, okay? And whereas if you look at things like nature sexual jealousy, there are both well-documented differences in the nature of sexual jealousy, men and women, and it aligns with theoretical prediction, okay? And the reason I stress this is because evolutionary psychology gets accused of just throwing out a few just-so stories. You see something and you say, well, maybe here's the adaptive story for that, and it is in the genes. And you should avoid that. But anyone who embraces this memo as being well-informed by evolutionary psychology is to some extent endorsing just-so stories. And so that's why it bothers me. And to my dismay, some actual evolutionary psychologists have rushed to this guy's defense. And the reason, and that gets back to the beginning of our conversation, the reason for that is, I think, the evolutionary psychologists, in talking about gender differences that we do have reason to think are genetic, okay, they've gotten tons of blowback on campus. In fact, an increasing amount, not a declining amount, because as you suggest, the climate has changed. And so that has led them to embrace anyone who is, it's like the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So I think that has led some of them to uncritically embrace this guy. And I just find all this unfortunate because I don't want.
Well, genetics and biology, I think would be in shaping human behavior.
I didn't hear that. You kind of got a band. Say that again.
I'm sorry. Not just genetics, but also the obviously related to genetics, but not specifically genetics. The hormones in altering the behavior of men and women and altering the way slightly differently the way their minds can work. I think it's an interesting debate. Obviously, my view, for what it's worth, and I read as much about this as one can, is that it's a banal view. It's obviously that genetics, biology, and culture are all wrapped up in this in ways that are quite hard to disentangle. But the assumption that the core assumption now, and this is not just the assumption of the campus, we found out from the National Labor Relations Board, it's now federal law, that any discussion of this in the workplace counts as sexual harassment. That
so
even discussing
had kind of settled law, the judicial opinion was on their side when they fired this guy?
Well, we haven't. He's taking there were two strands here. There's a suit that he's pursuing. So we'll find out. That hasn't happened yet, but it's ongoing. But this was an intervention by the National Labor Relations Board to say that he was fireable on the grounds that he raised the question of non-cultural sexual difference. In other words, that if it's not 50-50 male and female, the only explanation is misogyny and sexism. And he was fired from that, for that. But for saying that, not for anything he did, and even just for writing it in an internal document after having been invited to generate discussion after you've been put through one of these indoctrination programs, which you now also have to sit through if you apply to any major corporation. That's partly what I mean by the assault on science, on nature itself, on the possibility that we are biological as well as psychological beings, and the two may have an interaction, which strikes me as obviously a banal truth, but is now actually a fireable offense. That's what concerns me.
Well, I think it was certainly a tactical blunder for Google to fire him.
No, it was the tactical brilliance of them. Because
you think so?
Yes, because
I certainly consider it unfortunate they made the guy like a hero in a way that I think is in some ways unfortunate. But a hero. Well,
better than oppressing women in computer coding. I mean, better than that. Anything's better than that. People's lives are at stake. Women's lives are at stake, Bob.
I take
so much. It's so much bullshit. It's unbelievable, and yet it's now compulsory. And that's happened very quickly. And corporate America has completely capitulated, just as the academy has, to this kind of attack on science or biology or genetics having anything to do with difference in outcomes for different individuals along different matrices. And that strikes me as very frightening.
Yeah,
my poor dog,
okay, let me quickly plug your opioids piece. And just say you were describing not from personal experience, you were quoting people about what it's like to be on opioids. And, it sounds almost like a kind of bliss you can get through meditation. And it's one of many cases in which I guess the shortcut version can be destructive.
Yeah. I think all shortcuts are worrying. I think the intensity of this experience, I mean, I have not done it, so I'm listening to the most articulate people who talk about the high that they get. And it's something quite mysterious and obviously intense beyond anything they've ever experienced. And it seems to be fundamentally, if meditation is about overcoming suffering and pain, then this does exactly the same thing, except it takes you half an hour as opposed to 30 years of meditating to get there. It's harder and more difficult to do it that way. But the issue I wanted to address is why so much pain? Why is America in so much pain?
Right. And you said in the past, I mean, there's a line from this I've got somewhere, I think, you're right, if industrialization caused an opium epidemic, you're referring now to the, I guess, 19th century version of it.
There was an early 19th century epidemic in Britain with massive industrialization.
And so you say deindustrialization is doing the same thing.
Similar function in as much as people's lives and the meaning of their lives has been taken from them.
Mm-hmm.
And their families are broken down, which is also another huge contributor to this. And they live in places which were created entirely for a particular industry that no longer have a point. That the social atomization that is intensifying everywhere, the more loneliness people feel, the lack of even meaning they can ascribe to their own country and their own identity has become attenuated for reasons that you could dismiss and you can be hostile to or not, but I'm simply diagnosing it. And religion, which once provided a structure and a meaning for people, has collapsed either into a political artifact or into nothingness. And social media and these technologies have distracted us to such an extent that we're constantly snacking on fast food, which means that in the end, we're unhealthy spiritually, psychologically, and emotionally. And I was trying to do justice to that aspect of what's going on, because I think it's the core of what's going on, as well as the other sources of this. Is complicated. The sources of, obviously, the belief that OxyContin, for example, had resolved the problem of addiction because it would give you a continuous high and wouldn't give you highs and lows, turned out to be not true, and also just empirically and based on a few, very few surveys of very few people. Obviously, Big Pharma has a huge role and responsibility to play in this. Also, by the way, patient advocacy groups who demanded an end to pain as a right and were outraged when these things were not available. All that comes into play, I think, but we've now have this added, particularly dangerous element to this, which is fentanyl. Because of prohibition over a long time, and partly because of it, we know that under prohibition, substances that are illegal become more concentrated over time because it cuts down the risk of transportation and the cost of transportation. You can get more bang for smaller amounts, which means it's easier to transport and smuggle and so on and so forth. Well, fentanyl is, as we know, 50 times more powerful than heroin, and as people went from, a lot of people went from borrowing their friends' hydrocodone and oxycodone to having that run out, going to heroin, and then the heroin coming with fentanyl, and fentanyl being so concentrated that it kills you. And so what we have in a way is a poison entering into this already large market for opioids. And that poison is what's contributing to these massive numbers of overdoses. I mean, overdoses last year exceeding that of the toll in the Vietnam War. Overdose deaths that are now higher than the peak year of AIDS and not going down. And this should be, in my view, one of the most urgent questions that we should be discussing every single day, because these are probably 60,000 people this year, maybe 70, 80,000 people projected in 2 years' time to die of this. These are young people. They're of both races. This is now seeped back into the inner city among African Americans, fentanyl. And fentanyl is unstoppable. It's, again, you can get it off the dark web. It comes via FedEx. It comes via regular mail. There's no way to stop it. And it's so powerful.
If there's a cause for hope, it does seem to me there's a history with these things of people eventually, getting clued into the dangers and the downsides. I mean, they tend to be cyclical, right? I mean, like cocaine, crack, I don't know the numbers, but it seems like those epidemics subsided, right?
Yeah, they did. For all sorts of reasons. And maybe this will subside too. But heroin has a particularly tenacious hold on people. And it does not create the kind of broader social violence, for example. It's not associated with large amounts of street violence in the way that crack was, for example, in which people in the communities riven by this violence rose up and demanded, which the left currently denies, demanded greater policing and more incarceration as the response to this incredible level of violence. There isn't that level of violence. So you don't have those factors determining a change of view. The core reason for this is despair, and that's not being in any way addressed. So, yes, I mean, I asked someone this. For example, I asked a user in Baltimore, African-American dude, look, with fentanyl, it's obviously killing you, right? It's obviously dangerous. Why don't you seek out heroin that doesn't have fentanyl in it? Why do you not? Why is this not stigmatized? And his right was, he just looked at me and said, "You don't understand. It's once you've had that high, that fentanyl high, there's nothing like it.
So fentanyl was actually a better high than heroin?
Fentanyl?
Yeah.
Yeah. More intense. Just the most intense. It takes you right to the doors of death in its ability to suspend all pain and all feeling and euphoria. That's what, once you've tasted that, you want more. They're seeking out the fentanyl. They know that it's Russian roulette. They know they can't dose this correctly, but they're still doing it. And to give you an example of how badly this is spreading, 3 years ago in New Jersey, the police chief, one of the police chiefs, recently reported that 3 years ago there was 2% of the heroin was laced with fentanyl, and now 30% is. They found enough fentanyl in the trunk of a car to kill the entire population of New Jersey and New York City. In the trunk of a car. So this is a substance of such incredible danger that we need to be thinking about exactly how we stop this. Now, the only solutions that I've seen that really work, or actually that have worked, are safe access to heroin. Not methadone or buprenorphine, although they have an important role to play in this, as well as Naxalone, which is the drug that gets you out of the coma before you die. But it's pretty grim, Bob.
I do think, my understanding is that more than any other category of drugs, the advice is just do not even try it once. You may think you can control it, and there, I'm sure there are people who do, but do not tempt fate, because it's that powerful. It
takes very few people who can be. It is possible to live on heroin for 30, 40 years. You can do it but not when it's mixed in with this shit, and not if it starts.
Even when it's not, and maybe it's partly a product of the fact that you're getting it on the street and you never know, but. There are just a lot of people have died from straight up heroin overdoses.
It's true. It's a uniquely powerful and uniquely dangerous drug. We've had it since the beginning of time. This is.
I just mean the category, the opioid category.
Opium was huge. This country had. It was easier to get opium in 1870 in this country than it was to get tobacco in 1970. Right. But the problem is our technology and our minds, our ability to finesse this and to break it down into pharmaceutical elements and to create different possible variations on this. The level of sophistication that was unknown, obviously, in the 19th century, right, has meant that we're in what was once a ubiquitous painkiller is now, a very dangerous poison that the need for which and the addiction to which is still immense. So this is a big, big problem, and it doesn't look like the Trump administration has anything serious planned to help. And it's not something that seems to be motivating many people on the left either. A lot of this is red state.
Partly on the left it's thought of as and now I actually have no idea about this, but there can be a tendency.
Oh, it's white men.
Well, it's white Trump supporters. Of course, it's not just that, but I think the stereotype of it is, it's not your friend.
Somebody else this is happening to somebody else. It's not in our
right.
Every now and again, it's in someone's family, and they respond. But this is really talk about the powerless. They voiceless. It's a fucking tragedy that these people are still voting and supporting this guy who will do nothing. And it's a double tragedy that our identity politics has allowed some people to look away from this. It's no worse and no better than the way in which crack was dismissed as a black in the city thing and therefore didn't need to do anything about it. Or that AIDS is something that happens when these gay guys fuck each other up the ass. So they deserve it. There's this kind of sense that they got what's coming to them.
Well, I think, in a way, I think there is less of that this time around than, I will say one difference between this and the crack epidemic, it seems to me there was actually more demonized, and you could argue that this is because of the correlation with race, but in any event, it seems that there's, in a way, more demonizing of crack users. I mean, for example, if a woman was doing crack or cocaine while pregnant, like there wasn't a lot of pity for her. I mean, I actually see a lot of sympathetic treatments of these opioid victims. Now,
You're right.
That's because they're white, and the stereotypical crack mother wasn't. But I do think that's a little bit of a correlation.
Yep.
And it could be because of race.
I think some of it obviously is about race. I
mean, there wasn't.
There's nothing different about it's about despair. If there's no future for you, no family structure, and no meaning for your life in a city, you're going to take drugs, you're going to do crack, and also it's also a key part of the economy. I mean, the thing that happened was that you were on federal disability, which a lot of people were in these places. You could get 30-bottle pill for $3 copay and sell it for 10 grand on the street. So there was also a huge, under the ground economy building on this, and very little oversight of how many of these pills were being pushed out. I mean, there's one statistic that still blows my mind. That over a 6-year period, 780 million pills were distributed in West Virginia, which has a population of only 1.8 million people.
No.
And this was not just a slight overprescribing. This was an avalanche of the stuff.
Yeah. No, it's bad.
180 pill dosing. It's multi-determined, it's multi-causal, but I think at the bottom of it, if you try and pin it onto it's just evil pharma, or it's just lack of morale or self-control, none of that totally explains it. There's something going on, especially in this country, about core lack of meaning and of spiritual and emotional balance that is clearly driven by very changing demographics in part, but also primarily through technology and trade that have wiped out these people's livelihoods. And I think it's also a case where men seem to be particularly vulnerable to this, where one of my frustrations about the social justice feminism is that it's not looking to see actually where it might be out of date, where in fact men as a class are failing in this country. They're failing in education, particularly, which is a very important place to be succeeding in this kind of economy. I mean, I think in a few years' time, it'll be 58% of college graduates will be women. Women, this is an era of immense achievement for women everywhere. It is not a period of immense achievement for men. And the things that used to give them some status and meaning, which is this definition of manhood, we took care of your family, you were given a certain status, these actually gave men a reason to get up in the morning. And that's been taken away from them too. But there's a crisis of men in this country and we could talk about for a long time, and there's more interesting stuff, but I don't want to go there. But I think it's a slight contributing factor, and that certain constructs we have ideologically are not actually being responsive to reality, to its changing and constantly fluid nature.
Okay. Well, I will give you the last word.
Thank you. I'm sorry for all that provocation. I'm just being a contrarian. I'm just being one of these.
It's a living.
Contrarian white men.
You're a good one. And no, this has been great. And I hope it got you into more trouble than it'll get me into, but we'll see. At
this point, look, I could spend every evening fretting about what someone might think about what I say, and I'm determined. I will say stupid things from time to time. I'm a human being, and there'll be, you can fault me for that, especially when you're speaking contemporaneously. But for fuck's sake, we need to be less afraid, because fear stifles truth. And that's the key thing, I think, that that the ability to say things that are stupid and wrong is absolutely critical to the advancement of knowledge and to the advancement of our understanding of the world. Because it's only by correcting error that we get at the truth. If we freeze everything and everybody has to say the truth, what they think of as the truth all the time, then that truth will very quickly be outdated by reality. And so you'll be holding on to orthodoxies that are not relevant and valid. This is my meta-conservative position on the world, which is that the world changes. And that any ideology that doesn't change with it is a lie.
Was that term meta-conservative?
Meta, yeah. Epistemologically conservative in that sense.
You should get that URL. I haven't heard that.
Meta-conservatism is really, it's, for example, it's very Oakshottian in that sense, which is that the key is to sustain our arrangements as they are, and to sustain them as they are in a changing world, they have to be constantly changed. And the goal is to keep the show on the road, keep the thing coherent. And that sometimes means that if things are going off balance, for example, I'm much more left-wing now on economics than I was 30 years ago because the situation has grotesquely changed. Mm-hmm. And I regard that and this is the hard thing that people get, I regard that as a conservative move because it's adjusting to reality. It's a meta-conservative
Well, and it's an attempt to conserve certain features of society that are imperiled in your view.
I want to defend capitalism, and I think allowing this kind of grotesque inequality is discrediting it, undermining it, and destabilizing our society. Mm-hmm. So I favor aggressive measures to counter it. And for all my talk about identity politics and my dislike of its whole framework for understanding the world, I do think that the task of integrating more and more different kinds of people into our American experiment is critical. But it's not about regarding the American experiment itself as essentially flawed and wrong. It regards it as a work in progress. So, my work on marriage equality for many years was an attempt not to revolutionize society, but to integrate emerging gay people into the institutions that currently exist. It was a conservative move, even though people don't realize it or regard it otherwise.
Well,
that's a conservative move.
My closing advice to you is that your next book should be called "Conscience of a Meta-Conservative." It's a good term. You should work with it.
Yeah, it's where I'm coming from, really. It's anti-ideological. It's in favor of social coherence. It's in favor of a free society because that's our inheritance. Mm. That's what we have to preserve. That's our obligation to pass that to the next generation. And my concern is that electing this kind of president is an absolute abdication of that responsibility, but so too is the illiberal cultural Marxism that is attempting to undermine the entire experiment of America and to regard it as inherently and innately flawed, racist, and oppressive. So I regard the struggle against both as part of the same thing.
Okay, I'm going to resist the temptation to retort. You can have the last. Instead, I'm gonna go reserve Meta-Conservative.com, so you have to pay me royalties when your movement takes off. But thanks, Andrew. We'll link to all these pieces you wrote for New York.
Thank you.
Keep it up, and then I hope you'll come back and do this again before terribly long. Always a pleasure, Bob. Okay. Hang in there mindfully. Okay. Thanks, Andrew.